Excellent. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us at the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. It really is an honor to be facilitating on behalf of CIHE this webinar that serves also as a book launch for a really remarkable book, academic Star Wars. So truly the panelists for today need no introduction. So I will simply mention their names and in the order that they will be facilitating this conversation and sharing remarks with each one of us. But before I do that, I just want to spend a few seconds talking about housekeeping for our session. We are very happy that you all are joining us. We ask you to please mute or close your microphone and also to turn off your camera. This helps us to keep our attention on our speakers and to avoid distractions, but also it helps facilitate with bandwidth and some of those other issues to keep inclusive our event. We also ask you that you please type any questions that you may have for any of our three panelists throughout the presentation. Please use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom menu. You can type your question and as we get into the Q&A session, I will be very happy to bring those questions in. Once again, it's an honor to have you all with us. And it's also a great honor to have our three speakers, which I will present in the order of their participations. A last point is we want to encourage you all to note that this session is being recorded and will be posted in the YouTube channel for the Center for International Higher Education. So please keep that in mind as well. So the three panelists presenting and introducing this outstanding contribution to our field, this new book, are Phil Altbach, who is a professor emeritus here at Boston College, and also a distinguished fellow in the Center for International Higher Education. We're really delighted to have him join us today. We also have Dr. Maria Yudkevich, who is Director of Research at E-Quadrat, and also a research fellow in the Center for International Higher Education. And rounding up our distinguished panel of presenters, we have Professor Jamil Salmi, who is a global expert in higher education issues, a past World Bank lead in higher education, and also a professor emeritus at Universidad Diego Portales. So it's an honor to have all three of them with us. And with that in mind, I will give the floor to Professor Philip Altbach.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. It's a pleasure to, of course, be with you all today and to introduce our book, Academic Star Wars, which I should point out also is, thanks to the MIT Press, available free and open access, and you will see how to get that. We have a simple organization for our session today. I will introduce it, say a few things about how we got into this, and a few observations about our data. Maria will talk about some of our case studies, and Jamil will conclude with some lessons learned. So we hope with these brief 10-minute presentations that we give you a sense of the book, and we have left plenty of time for questions and comments from our audience, and we hope the audience will take advantage of this. Why study academic excellence initiatives? These are a key way that a small number of countries have tried with reasonable success to upgrade their top universities and increase their research capacity. So we thought these would make very interesting case studies and indeed lessons on change in higher education. Of course, these excellence initiatives are aimed only at the top research universities, and with the idea in a number of the countries to have a positive influence on the entire academic system. We have used the methodology which we have used frequently under the leadership of Maria Yudkevich, of asking world-renowned experts in their countries to reflect on a common set of themes and issues. And our case study chapters, as you will see when you read the book, are framed around this sort of common research focus, but with the expertise of people who really know the countries they're talking about. It's interesting, of course, that these academic excellence initiatives were carried out not one in Anglophone countries and exclusively in Asia and Europe. There are none in Africa. There are none in Latin America. There are none in North America. So it's an interesting phenomenon from that point of view. And I suppose we could speculate on some of the reasons why, but we have no serious answer to that, I think. Some of the questions we asked are, how did the idea of academic excellence vary across countries and across systems? Because we found in the case studies that the goals and questions that were being asked in the different countries varied quite a bit. And that's not surprising. Is there a recipe for success that can be broadly provided and understood? And Jamil Salmi will reflect on that a bit in his comments. Were there general consequences for the universities and for the academic systems in their countries? In other words, was there kind of a trickle-down effect, perhaps, of some of these AEIs? Did they affect the broader higher education systems? Can one claim that academic excellence initiatives have had a significant impact on the global standing of national academic systems or on individual universities in their countries? And finally, are academic excellence initiatives a good strategy for higher education systems? And could they be recommended for other countries to think about? A few observations, because time is limited. And these are just sort of plucked from some of my observations from the book and from our research. The global rankings, Times Higher Education and the others, have been very influential on the thinking about AEIs. In our view, much too influential, but that's the reality. Each country thought about the global rankings, and the Russians even included the rankings in their informal title of their initiative. It was called the 5-100 initiative. The idea being to have 5 Russian universities included in the top 100 of the rankings. By the way, on that score, total failure, but there were some positive elements, of course, too. Globalization was a clear underpinning of the higher education systems and the institutions involved, and had a major role in the thinking in each country about how they were going to involve themselves in their own academic excellence initiative, and looking around the world for what they wanted to do with them. So globalization was an underpinning. It included, of course, the increase in research capacity, the use of English, the change of academic models, by the way, in significant direction of moving institutions, these top research institutions, in the direction of the broadly the American Research University idea. The AEIs, of course, were part of the broader globalization of science as well, and the fact that research is communicated increasingly worldwide. The AEIs function, of course, in the context of massification, and a part of which includes complex and differentiated academic systems. Our book and the AEIs and the institutions involved, of course, are involved only at the very top of those academic systems. These are elitist efforts, and we see no criticism in that, but because we believe, and of course, more important, what all of the countries believe is that their top universities, they need to have distinguished research universities. Internationalization, broadly stated, is a key part of the goals of the AEIs in all of the countries that we looked at. And finally, academic excellence initiatives are very expensive. In some countries, more expensive than others. And the financing came exclusively from governments. As an example, China probably spent about $100 billion, by far the largest amount of money. Indeed, China probably spent, if you put all of the countries together, probably spent more than half of what the rest of the world spent in itself, together. And some of the countries, take Denmark as an example, were quite modest in the funding, but had really pretty positive results in the limited areas that they defined their AEIs. So those are some of the sort of general comments about how we got into this effort and what we think are some of the broader issues. And these will be discussed both by Maria and Jamil in more detail going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Professor Yudkevich.
Thank you much, Gerardo. Hello, everyone. I will probably start with saying thank you to those of you who are here, but also to our country chapter authors, whose contribution made those books possible and reach. Thanks a lot. It was a great journey. And it's really great to see so many colleagues from so many countries. And I know that some of you are working in countries who are now thinking about academic initiatives. And we do hope that our book can probably help you in deciding whether and how those programs may be implemented in your countries. I would probably also start with saying a few words about our book title. With such a co-editor team, it's always a great pleasure and fun to think about what should be the best title for the book. And when we're choosing the title for this book, 1.5 years, we made the choice toward academic Star Wars. And I wish it were not so close to reality, because at that time, thinking about Star Wars was just fun. And now it's much more sensitive issue, but and some things are which I described in the book became now a history, because most of the things written before the war in Ukraine have started. But at the same time, we're really happy that we have for some period of time picked in this book and have it as described. So there are probably 25,000 universities across the globe, and about small part of them, probably 1,200, are research intensive, and only tiny part of those institutions participate in academic excellence initiative. And still, we think it's important to care about this tiny part, because they make a major phenomena in the whole academic landscape of the world. It changed that global landscape. That's what basically our book is about. We made a choice toward 9 countries all over the globe, in Europe and also in Asia. Those are China, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Taiwan, Denmark, France, Germany, and Russia. All those countries are with very different systems. For example, in terms of age, say Malaysia had the first university established in the middle of 20th century, 1949, while the history of German universities go back to many centuries. Those countries are also very different in terms of number of universities. For example, Denmark has just 8 public institutions, while China has over 3,000 higher education institutions in the country. And what we can see from our cases is that the impact of those initiatives on the whole systems might be quite different. It might be quite large, for example, like in cases of China or Taiwan, or substantially smaller as in the case of Denmark. We also see that the group of those initiatives is not homogeneous in terms of goals and rationales, and it has several waves. For example, the first wave and the first initiative started before the emergence of global academic rankings, namely in China in the middle 90s and South Korea at the end of 90s. And those programs had more endogenous characters, we would say, because they reflected a long-term national strategic concern about economic and social development. At the same time, on the contrast, the second wave of academic excellence initiatives that we consider was induced more by relative or external consideration, which linked to perceived competitive disadvantages positions in comparison with more prominent performance by top US or UK universities or just neighboring countries. And that second wave, it happened in time when the concept of world-class university started to gain a lot of attention. That's why in the second wave, many universities cared about how they look like in the global higher education landscape. So different countries use different wording for that. For example, China quite often talk about establishing world-class universities. In Malaysia, the concept of excellence is often considered in the public documents. In Japan, in Taiwan, experts talk about the creation of global competitive universities, a symbol of global competitiveness of the country itself. And France's concern was little visibility in ranking of the country universities and also research output of the country. At the same time, in some countries, there was a move during the realization of those initiatives from the ideal of global competitiveness toward more egalitarian approach on the later stages, due both political and economic reasoning. For example, it was the case in Taiwan and in Russia. But in many ways, government play a major role in funding, design, and also implementation of initiatives in all those programs, which is reflected also in the change of funding models of those universities during the course of the programs. I will probably quote one document of Danish government dated by 2006, which I think very nicely and straightforward explains what's the idea of this type of funding. It says that universities that are doing well should be rewarded, and poor quality should have consequences. How, by the way, the progress is measured? In most of the cases, the progress is measured by ranking. As Phil mentioned, in Russia, it was initially stated even in the title of the Russian program. In most of other countries, rankings are mentioned as a key performance indicators in their documentation. And if you see on the results regarding the ranking, we can see that in many cases, Shanghai ranking is used as a proxy measure for research-intensive universities. And we can see that China experienced probably the most remarkable rise, jumping from no university in first 200 in 2004 to even 7 institutions among top 100 in 2022. Denmark now has 2 universities in top 100, starting from 1 in 2004. France keeps the same positions, while Germany and Japan has lost 3 and 2 respectively. So we see here that results in terms of ranking is quite ambivalent, but it's of course could be explained as the general increasing competitiveness of their global ranking game in the world. But what I think is more important in terms of results of those initiatives is that those programs, they created to build an important critical mass of top quality, outstanding faculty, and top students in those institutions. In some programs, for example, like in South Korea and Germany, improving the quality of graduate education was put is one of the key targets of some part of the program. And another positive results, which is also important for not just institutions, but for the national system as well, is that many universities, including those beneficial universities, had this huge visible reduction in academic inbreeding and growth of academic mobility. Many countries express concerns that autonomy is essential for becoming world-class university, and the need for more freedom in university strategies and decisions during the course of the program is mentioned by many countries like Korea, Taiwan, and Russia. That creates attention in universities, demand for autonomous decision-making, and many other concerns. What is also quite well seen from the chapters, and I'm sure that Jamil will probably comment on that, is that academic initiatives are not a substitute for reforms when it comes to improving the higher education system in general. And of course, they should be always complemented by reforms that aimed the system in general. I'll probably stop here, and Jamil will add a lot of insightful comments.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your comments. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Salmi. Jamil, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. Just a few points to complement what Phil and Maria have already mentioned. One challenge we faced is, when we try to come to conclusion, is how could we really assess the impact of these excellence initiatives? And as Maria mentioned, one criteria which you can rely on are the progress in the rankings, but the data are not very conclusive, apart from the case of China, which really shows a tremendous progress in and Denmark has been mentioned, but then you have countries that have fallen back in spite of their excellence initiative, as Japan and Germany showed. Mind you, there are also countries that did not have an excellence initiative that have fallen back, US being one example. The challenge of measuring impact, is linked to at least two aspects. First is that we have to recognize that upgrading, transforming, improving universities is a long-term process. Many of these initiatives had a duration of 5 years. Sometimes they were extended to a second period of 5 years, but even 10 years may not be sufficient to see a big impact on universities. When you look at some outstanding universities that have emerged in the past 20 years in the world, not necessarily as part of excellence initiative. I'm thinking of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, EPFL, Polytechnic Lausanne, or Arizona State University. These universities worked at their transformation for more than 15 years, or sometimes close to 20 years. So that's one of the first challenges. The second is, it's even if you see progress, for example, in terms of the rankings, it doesn't mean that there is a causality effect that would really explain. So we have to be very tentative in our assessment of the impact of this excellence initiative. However, we can see definitely some trends. It certainly had pushed institutions to work hard on internationalization, trying to get foreign students, being more selective because they would have a wider pool of candidates for doctoral studies, for postdocs, bringing top, that's the title about Star Wars, bringing top researchers from other countries, bringing promising young researchers from other countries, bringing people back from the diaspora. We've seen that in many of the country examples. So in terms of internationalization, that has definitely been, we've seen a very positive impact. Just a parenthesis about the Star Wars element. I'm speaking to you from a provincial town in Chile called Temuco, and I was just over lunch before this meeting. They were telling me how they lost one of their top researchers to a university in Santiago, in the capital city, because the professor got a salary offer he couldn't resist. So it's happening internationally. It's also happening nationally in many countries. What are some of the other elements that we saw? Some countries, well, many years ago, I developed a framework to explain how you become a world-class university. I identified 3 sets of factors: talent, resources, and governance. And what happened with the excellence initiatives is that it has brought additional resources to a few universities, and with the purpose of bringing in talent and nurturing talent. But what we could observe through many of our case studies, that few countries have addressed this critical issue of governance. A positive exception is Denmark, where the excellence initiative followed wholesale reforms to improve the funding of universities and to transform the governance. For example, they moved from having democratic election of their university rectors to having a professional search led by the university board. But in other countries which have been traditionally suffered governance issues, lack of institutional autonomy, for example, France and Germany, there was no significant governance reform to to try to make universities more flexible, more innovative. So, that's one of the interesting findings of our report. Some countries, Japan, Taiwan, try to introduce governance reforms, and we haven't seen the effect yet, but that's a promising development. One of the challenges that some systems face, as you may know, is that they are sometimes segmented between the universities and the national research institutions, as was the case in Russia, in Germany, and France. And in many cases, it has remained a challenge, although these initiatives have tried to bring the two parties closer together. It's important. Phil mentioned in his introduction that indeed most of the excellence initiatives focused on developing research-intensive universities, but there were quite a few interesting exceptions. Taiwan and France, for example, really put emphasis on teaching as well, on bringing in innovation in teaching, and that was quite a revolution in the system, and that trying to counterbalance the trends fueled by the rankings of judging the performance of universities only by their research results. So that's also an interesting development. Another point worth mentioning is that the question that Maria raised about the impact of these excellence initiatives on the overall higher education system in the countries concerned. And it's interesting to see that in many cases, even those universities that were not selected when there was a competitive process to choose a few universities, some of them have tried to improve their performance, to introduce reforms, even in the absence of additional resources. By the way, some of the excellence initiatives were also pushing universities to diversify their resources. In the case of France, for example, the universities were encouraged to reach out to the local economy, to the local, the territorial entities to provide additional funding. So that's also a side benefit of these initiatives. In some countries, we could see tensions between the search for academic excellence and dimensions of equity, between the search for academic excellence and academic freedom. And that's a question that is still pending. Can you become or remain a top universities when there is no, when you have limitations on access to the internet, on academic freedom? And we could even ask this question in the case of the United States, where we see now really two different trends in the red states, where you have Republican government, and the blue states. And you may have seen recent news about professors trying to leave Florida because of the change in governance and the generally hostile attitude of the local governments towards public universities and the public good function that they have traditionally performed. It's the theme of equity and selectivity is also interesting. It's, you know, do you have to be totally elitist to be a top university, or can you be a more inclusive university? And I mean, we could compare what happens at the Ivy League universities in the US or universities like Berkeley that are more open. We don't have enough data to look at all the countries that we investigated in our book, but this is an important question to ask about the future of higher education system. One of the questions Maria mentioned is what happened to the rest of the system? Does it, if you have a concentration of additional resources on a few universities, there is a risk that the rest of the system would be starved, and this is we've seen various results. As I mentioned, Denmark had already had a funding reform, so the Excellence Initiative, whose amounts of additional funding were not too high, did not really have a negative impact on the rest of the system. As Maria mentioned, this is not an excuse to avoid reforms for the entire system. Many countries suffer from, or universities, especially public universities in these countries, suffer from insufficient institutional autonomy, and when the Excellence Initiative have pushed in that direction, that has benefited the whole country. An interesting question would be to ask ourselves, and maybe that will be our second book, how do you, or next book, how do you explain the success of other countries that didn't have excellence initiatives? You can think of the United States, of Canada, of Australia, countries where we've seen, and especially in the case of Australia, tremendous progress over the past 10, 15 years without something that we could describe as an excellence initiative. So it would be interesting to try to understand what are the mechanisms that allowed universities in these countries to make significant progress. I'm always struck by the example of the Netherlands, which, to my knowledge, is the only country in the world that has its own, I think they have 13 universities in the top 150 in the Shanghai ranking. So I think I will stop at this for now, and we're really looking forward to your questions to be able to go deeper in some of the aspects we have just covered.
Thank you very much, Jamil. Thank you very much, Phil and Maria, for your remarks. I think you are giving us a wonderful overview of this remarkable book and its contributions. And certainly the chat is reflecting the great interest that there is. Please let me take a moment right now to apologize if we don't get to all of the questions. I think there is likely to be more conversation and obviously discussion of many of these questions. So I will try my very best to try to prioritize some of these. I think some of these questions may take a little bit more time to unpack. So if we don't get to your questions, apologies in advance. But certainly we have a very lively conversation going, and I will try to pick a few of these that I think resonate with our audience. So let me start actually with one question coming from our colleague Elena Denisova-Schmidt, who is asking, first of all, she's sharing her congratulations on this achievement in completing this book. And now that the book has been finished and published, and as you look back at the book and the beginning of the project, what would you do differently? I think this is always an interesting question when it comes to a book like this, that it takes years to produce and to publish. So what would you do differently? Perhaps here we could think about how the world indeed has changed since you started with this project. I think this question is to all three of you, so certainly we could go in any order that that you would like. Jamil, it looks like you might be ready. Yes, go ahead.
May I start? Just linking to one of the last comments I made is that perhaps it would have been useful to include one or two national case studies of countries that did not have an excellence initiative, but where you have universities doing well or sometimes improving. I'm thinking, for example, of the Australian case. And second, perhaps, is, and I don't know what could be interesting to see what my co-conspirators think, is maybe having more detailed analysis of what happens in systems where you have these powerful national research organizations that are well-resourced. Sometimes they have more money than universities, and to understand how useful or are there hindrances. I think that would be worth researching, but perhaps that's a topic for another book.
Yes. Well, we did ask our research team to focus on that because a number of the countries that are included have this sort of dual system of universities and strong, well-funded research institutes. And I think a generalization that we take away from the studies is that most of the excellence initiatives in such countries encouraged, or in some cases insisted, that the universities link up better with their research institutes. And, you know, that may be, to me, that's an important lesson, that it's very important that these institutes be involved. Yeah, but I think, you know, underlying that question is an important point, which I think we, generally speaking, got right. And that is, and we've done this with a number of other research projects too, of asking asking very good researchers in their countries to focus on their countries in a broader conceptual theme. And I think all of our contributors did a nice job with that, as you'll see when you read the book. And so no doubt there are things that can be done better. One thing that we missed in the book was the chance to bring all of our contributors, our researchers, together physically in a room to discuss the chapters. We've done that in a number of our efforts in the past, and COVID, unfortunately, prevented us from doing that. So this book was entirely a distance operation. So, Maria, any thoughts?
Surprisingly, in this project, I would probably follow the same logic as we did. I would be personally more careful about forecasts for the future, which now is some chapters are considered as fairy tales and things that would be never achieved. And that's a little bit, that's of course pity. Me personally, I always would love to see more micro data, which allows us to learn more about real impact of different policies, not only on the beneficiary universities, but also on their system in general, and probably on the societies in general. But in general, I'm quite happy that we follow this methodology. And thanks for Zoom's technologies that we learned by that time quite well. We had very good discussions over Zoom.
Great, thank you all for these comments and these reflections retrospectively, looking at this book. Certainly, we have more questions coming in, and I would like to take one question from our colleague Marcelo Noble. As we know, he's in Brazil, and he also is congratulating the team for this accomplishment. And he's pointing us to an article that was recently published in Nature regarding bad behavior or unethical behavior by researchers who may have an excessive number of papers and perhaps a very limited, if any, involvement in those publications directly. So the question is, could there be any correlation between the search of some of these bad practices in different fields and these excellence initiatives? And could you please comment more generally about some of the concerns that these excellence initiatives may trigger? I think this is also a question for all three of you. We can go in any order that you wish. So what concerns were identified perhaps as a result of these?
Well, just to start out with one, which we've mentioned already, which is this too elitist? And my answer is not no, that all countries, in my view, need research universities. And this is one, not the only, but one strategy toward getting there. And in this case, in the countries involved as quickly as possible. I think there's an understanding in all of the countries that these research universities that are involved in the AEIs are part of complex and increasingly differentiated academic systems, and all should be appropriately supported, which in many cases they're not. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Phil. Maria,
I'll
Jamil?
probably-
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Gerardo. I'll probably comment on the first part of Marcelo's question about the correlation between bad behavior and those initiatives. Of course, we need micro data, for example, symptometrics data, to be able to answer that. But I think there are several lines that move in different directions. First, universities which are supported in the countries are the best and strongest institutions there. So they have some degree of academic morale and everything, which support and stops this kind of behavior. From another side, we can see that incentives to publish more are too strong probably in some environments, and people start like investing money, effort, etc. in predatory publishing. But at the same time, the government agencies which control universities also have incentives to control for that behavior as well. And in some countries, including, for example, Russia, ministries search for this kind of behavior and try to stop them through different kinds of punishment, extra bonuses who don't follow the strategies, etc. So again, to answer that, we need to have more sound microdata. But I think that in general, there is of course a concern that in many universities which start moving from their teaching missions toward research missions, quite often faculty get confused and see perfect correlation between academic excellence and position rankings, which is not, of course, always the case, and confused between those two, and thus, of course, create different kinds of risk and misbehavior.
Thank you. Jamil?
Yeah, just perhaps add 1 or 2 points. A few months ago, there was a publication, I think, in the main newspaper in Spain, El País, about the case of a Spanish researcher who was affiliated with a Spanish university, but in fact had a double affiliation with a Saudi university, which I will not mention. But I think sometimes you have these adverse practices where universities are trying to cut corner and to buy highly cited researchers or their publications so that they can increase their ranking. And that's really a very unfortunate result of the academic Star Wars. So this is something, and I think that's the challenge of when you rely too much on ranking, and when ranking are biased towards research papers, and usually research papers published in English, it can be a serious problem.
Thank you very much. I think this gives us a very complete picture about some of the challenges. Certainly now it's very clear that I won't be able to get to all of the questions, so apologies in advance for that. There is a question, however, and it's impossible to separate this very important academic work from certainly the geopolitical environment that we are in. So our colleague Igor Chirikov is asking our panel, so any and all of you are welcome to address the question. The question is, what is your take on how did the Russian Excellence Initiative contribute to the war effort in Ukraine? Of course, it's understandable that the chapter was written before the invasion began, but what would you say is the impact of this academic excellence today?
Can I make a comment on that, maybe to let Maria off the hook a little bit?
Yes, Phil, please.
And I'd welcome her comments too. I was on the Russian 5100 commission, so saw that effort over a number of years from the inside. And I think the work that the commission did and the Academic Excellence Initiative in Russia had, again, we're talking pre-Ukraine, a positive impact both on improving some of the top Russian universities and on instilling a sense of reform and new ideas about universities throughout the system. And I think that was really quite positive, the focus on internationalization and so on. It's impossible to answer the question of how the 5100 or the Russian higher education system directly contributed to the war in Ukraine. Probably in the margins, the scientific research in some areas did. And of course, Russian universities in the past and the Soviet days contributed significantly to the military industrial complex in the country. I would say that basically all of the accomplishments of 5100, and they are significant, have been destroyed by the war and, well, the Putin government's policies toward higher education, and in general by the war in Ukraine. Internationalization for Russia is at an end. And I think that the Russian academic system is really back to the Soviet days and will be for a long time. Even after the war there hopefully ends at some point, as soon as possible, mainly because of the views of the Russian government, the end of internationalization, the decline in numbers of international faculty, which was a strong push from 5100, and governance reforms, and one could go on and on. We don't have time here. But I think that basically the accomplishments that were made have largely been undone. And of course, with a waste of a lot of human resources, lots of Russian scholars have left the country, and with the waste of a lot of money that was spent by the Russian state on this effort. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Phil. Maria or Jamil, would you like to add anything? We have more questions indeed, so you certainly are welcome to do that, or we can move on.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to add anything to what Phil just said. I think that the war really created all conditions for any effort toward internationalization or even building a strong higher education system in the country oriented toward global standards that were completely destroyed. And it continued in this way, and all our programs for increasing competitiveness, which are now implemented in the country, they a lot, of course, contribute to the war effort. And even all documentation really suggests like simple wording about that. but it's really hard to add anything to what Phil just said. I completely sadly agree with what has been said.
Thank you. Great. So I think we could conclude with one last question, which may bring some of these ideas together. So this question is from Audrey Haroch. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name. The question is, in addition to the congratulations on this excellent book, is how, to what extent are these different academic excellence initiatives connected to each other? Has one model become more dominant than the other? And do actors involved in these policies coordinate in any way with each other? I think this would be a really nice way to maybe, in addition to any closing thoughts that each one of you may have, could bring us to a close. In other words, these initiatives are not in a vacuum. We know and those involved in those initiatives are aware that they're happening in other national contexts. How are they connected to each other?
Yeah, I can start just very, very briefly. I don't think they are much connected. I mean, yes, everybody is aware, all the people involved, that these initiatives are going on, but we saw in the data lots of important differences among the countries, different methodologies of proceeding, different amounts of funding, different goals, and so on. And it's not my impression, colleagues, please correct me, that people involved at the government level or at the academic level were talking to each other across borders.
Thank you, Phil. That's very intriguing indeed. Maria, would you like to go next?
Yes, I think in general, I do agree with Phil. Also, I see some countries which are, for example, Kazakhstan, which are now intensively studying their experience of different countries to World Academic Excellence Initiatives, thinking about their own future programs or some circulation of ideas. But at the same time, I believe that the design and the whole idea of each academic excellence initiative in different countries substantially depend on current landscape of higher education system in the country, on the system of certification, on economic and social context. And this kind of context do define the design of the system much more than any ideas of best practices which exist all over the world.
Thank you very much. Jamil?
Yes, I can only concur with my colleagues, is that while these initiatives perhaps were triggered by the rankings and the perception that the countries did not have the proper recognition or their universities were behind. When the first edition of the Shanghai ranking was published in 2003, both Germany and France, which host very famous traditional universities like Heidelberg or La Sorbonne, were really shocked by the results, or the poor results, or relatively poor results of their top universities. But then it had a very positive effect on forcing countries to look inward and try to understand what were the characteristics, the national policies, the structural elements that explained their poor showing. And I agree with both Maria and Phil in saying that in all the cases I know, it was really designed in the context of the national culture, politics, regional differences, etc. And that it's very interesting. Now, some of them talk to each other. I know that the French, who started after the Germans, looked at Germany because there are very strong linkages between the two countries. But I haven't seen much collaboration across these universities that are part of the initiative. Rather, you see collaboration within countries. France now has an association of the beneficiaries of the excellence initiatives which they did not have before.
Thank you very much.
As,
Phil, go ahead. Yeah.
As Jamil pointed out, most of the countries really didn't deal with the governance issue. The Russians tried with a little bit of success, now destroyed. But that's, I think, a weakness of the system. And it would be interesting, we should have another session, as to whether the three of us think overall these initiatives were successful or not. So maybe we can leave that as a question for a future discussion, but it's an important question. Lots of money was spent, lots of effort was made by really good people, smart people, lots of commitments from governments who were serious about research and higher education with differing results in the different countries. But in the last analysis, did it work?
Well, and certainly with thank you for these remarks, for your questions. This has to be the fastest hour I have ever experienced because we are out of time. So apologies to all of those whose questions we couldn't get to. But however, I encourage you to, first of all, do like many of us have already done and download the book. You will certainly, I'm sure, get some new insights by reading it and engaging. And I think certainly the conclusion for today's session is that we should have indeed another session to continue these important discussions. In the meantime, however, I want to thank each one of you for joining us. And I want to ask you to join me in thanking Professors Altbach, Salmi, and Yudkevich for their contributions and their insights to our session today. Thank you very much, and we will be posting this recording in the coming days.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.